We're all here for global economic issues.
Hell yeah.
All right, so I'm going to talk just basically about global economic issues, or at least I'm going to just talk about the concept of international trade, commodities trading, currency trading, talk about trade agreements, talk about the international organizations that kind of oversee them. Then we'll go into just some Q&A, all right? So international trade was originally based off the Ricardian theory of comparative advantage, and that there are, it's explained by, that common example of there are two nations, each with a set amount of resources that they have to try and reach an equilibrium to where, each side gets the necessary stuff that they need while still being able to sustain the state. How many of you have ever heard of an Edgeworth box? Nobody? So an Edgeworth box is meant to show comparative advantage, and it's just a box like this. And you have two names. You have Octavio and Abby. And the basic way that this works is that you have Abby's commodity X goes this way, so commodity X, which we'll just say is commodity X. This is commodity Y, and then Octavio's commodity X is commodity Y. And this is basically saying that each nation has X amount of total resources. So let's say that X for the total is 10 and the Y is 20. So they have 10 liters of water and 20 pounds of hamburger meat. And the way that equilibrium is reached is what's called the Pareto optimal. And the Pareto optimal is basically the line that runs like this through, and it's a little less shitty than I did it, but it basically runs through the box, and each of the curves tells you where you can reach some aspect of equilibrium between the states that would allow for optimum distribution of goods to make sure that everyone had anything. So this is basically if Octavio's community had the minimum of each, if Abby's community had the minimum of each, and then if there was a perfect equilibrium. So you can use the Pareto optimum to kind of tell where comparative advantage should be set. Now, this is just the basic intro to comparative advantage. It moves beyond, and it actually has been explained to have a few deficiencies, probably because it was based off an initial assumption of this notion of not having an interconnected globe. As the globe has become more interconnected and there's a variety of more factors in different nations, and as well as a bunch of different products and different ways to improve these products, you've now switched from comparative advantage to what's called, I gotta get the name quite right, International Product Fragmentation Theory. That's right. So now what we have is International Product Fragmentation Theory. And what this explains is, rather than just this question of trading goods between nations and reaching equilibrium, there is an equilibrium that is reached on a globe over the fragmentation over a specific product. Let's take, for example, something like apple producers in Washington. So Apple producers in Washington. So they obviously they create the raw product. So Washington apple producers price the raw product, but that product goes through other processes like cleaning, distribution, and all of those different areas tend to either come from one country or a separate country. So that is, in this situation, they may get immediately packed to China for distribution and packaging, and then they get shipped to, let's say, Thailand, who consumes. So in this, just this basic example, this simple market of apple consumption in Thailand has areas that go through different fragments of the supply chain that explains and reaches this question of equilibrium. So that is how we now commonly understand trade, is that it's not trade between two nations, it's trade along a connection that has been established along some global trade or supply line. Clear? Okay, so with a general understanding of how we view trade, let's talk a little bit about commodities trading. So, who can tell me what a commodity is?
Goods and services.
Goods and services. Yeah. And in this situation, it's in essence a good. So it is just some good that you can sell. There are soft commodities. Soft commodities are things like oil and coffee and other agriculture stuff. And then you have hard commodities. And hard commodities are your things like your gold, your silver, your ore, etc. You also have, in commodities, you have what are called cash commodities or actuals. And cash commodities or actuals are the physical thing you trade. That is like the wheat that you have to actually give to someone. That is less likely in today's market. And now what we have are called derivatives. And derivatives are, in essence, a catch-all word for a bunch of different financial tools that we have. And let me talk about a little bit what they are. So under derivatives, you have a few different things. The first of which you have is what's called a forward contract. And a forward contract is a contract where you agree to give a certain amount of products at a price that's set today. So the market price today. So you have buyer or seller A selling to buyer B, and what a forward contract would be is buyer A agrees to sell to buyer B, 100 bushels at today's market price. So basically it is an agreement that when you have this, I will pay you this, right? That is a forward contract where the price is set by the market. That is different than a futures contract. And a futures contract is primarily the contract that's run under derivatives. And a futures contract is where you have buyer A and seller A and buyer B. And instead of selling an amount to an agreed upon price, they sell an amount for negotiated price. Why would seller A want to sell for a negotiated price? If you're a farmer who's selling bushels, why would you want to negotiate your price?
Thinks the price will go up.
In case the price, you want to hedge against the prices potentially collapsing at future dates. So you want to sell for a negotiated price that may be not as good as the market price today, but it can be based upon a trend in the future. Like if you are worried about next year not being successful, you might be fine with selling for a negotiated price because you're concerned about that. If you're a buyer, you might be fine selling with a negotiated price because otherwise the price at the later date when you would have to purchase it would be exorbitant and you would be overpaying for the wheat that you could have got for a lot less. All right? The last one that I want to talk about is what's called a swap. And a swap is a little interesting. So a swap, I'm trying to remember exactly what this is and how to describe it to you. So a swap, let's see the best way to describe this to all of you in a way that doesn't just confuse the hell out of you, because it's a really interesting term. So basically what a swap is that you agree to pay the price for wheat or for whatever commodity you want to for a fixed price instead of the market price for an extended period of time. So you might, if you are a seller A, you might agree to sell all of your wheat or a certain selection of wheat at one price for an extended period of time. That is a commodity swap. You swap out the market price for a pre-agreed price, not for a one-time contract, but for a determined period of time. Does that make sense? So that's the difference on a swap. So in America, how commodities trading used to be done was on a much smaller level, and it was done through these future contracts. Basically, you would have a cereal producer go to the market and sell their stuff, or they would offer a futures contract where they would sell this amount of money for, or they would sell this amount of bushels for this amount of money. The problem was, and I think the problem you can see with any market, is that sometimes there's going to be buyers where there's not sellers, and sometimes there's going to be sellers when there's not buyers, which can cause problems in the market and causes market distortion. What we put in that, what we did to resolve that, is we created speculation. Speculation is where you have a non-hedger. A hedger is a direct participant in the market, a buyer or seller. When you have someone who's not a buyer or seller, like a third party, in most situations it's a bank or some sort of financial service, what they do is they will buy from the buyers when there's no sellers and sell to the sellers when there's no buyers. So basically, they would buy wheat at a futures contract from a producer and then sell it to a seller at another's future contract, making a small profit by negotiating prices. They would negotiate the price low enough from the farmer and then high enough to the seller so that they would make a profit in the middle. It was a decent profit, but nothing too exorbitant. The reason for this was back in when speculation, after the 1929 collapse, we instituted what's called position limits. And position limits are the limit, the amount the speculators are allowed to own. So basically saying that all speculation, back in the 1930s, it was limited to 10%. The entire market of speculators could not own more than 10% of a particular amount of a market. Why would that be? Why would they limit speculators to only owning that much? Yeah, if they get much more, it's too easy to manipulate the prices. They can begin to own and artificially drive up prices, which would allow them to sell off these future contracts that they've collected up over a long period of time. So, fast forward to the 1980s. Under the 1980s, you had 14 separate institutions, most of them large banks, write letters to the CFTC. What's the CFTC? Yeah.
Commodities Futures Trading Commission.
Commodities Futures Trading Commission, which dealt with commodities trading, and futures trading, which is futures contracts for commodities. They wrote letters to the CFTC saying, look, we've got so much skin in the game as speculators, you should just treat us like hedgers. And unbeknownst to Congress or the executive, or unbeknownst to Congress at the time, this executive branch okayed these 14 letters, allowing for basically in secret speculators to own more than 10% of the market. This is problematic for a few reasons. The first of which is, like we mentioned, it drives up commodity prices. How much? So, for example, I think there's a few estimates that says that because of Wall Street speculation on oil, we pay anywhere from 86 to $1.49 extra per gallon of gas. And then the best example would be the very obvious one, which was the Goldman Sachs aluminum example. Goldman Sachs bought up something like 35% of the world's aluminum and kept it, and artificially rose aluminum prices that they could then sell off later at exorbitant prices because they were buying it on the cheap, and so they were able to get huge amounts of aluminum. The funny story is, in order to avoid getting tagged as illegal speculation or holding on to products, because there are laws that says you can't hold on to stuff for too long, they got around this rule through a clever loophole, which is you just have to move it. So they were moving giant orders of aluminum from one factory that they owned to another factory or plant that they owned. And that was perfectly legitimate. So Goldman Sachs was able to own quite a bit of aluminum and drive up the price of that, which obviously aluminum is a pretty important commodity. It will also drive up the price of everything else that subsequently needs aluminum. So canned sodas, for example. You wonder why Diet Coke jumped from $4 a gallon to $6, or from $4 a 12 pack to $6 a 12 pack?
Yeah.
Look to the increased aluminum prices. Yeah, I know, it's a pain in the ass. Okay, any questions about commodities trading?
What was the 14?
There were there's a big list of them, but they're major banks and financial institutions. Yeah.
You had a word for cash commodities.
Actuals.
Actuals.
Actuals. All right. Anything else about commodities? All right. Let's talk about currency trading. Currency trading is pretty cool, but also super duper scary. So. Like it says, it's just trading currencies on an open market that are filtered through exchanges. I think the exchanges are the two are EBS and Reuters 3000 Extra or something like that. That's not important. Those are just the filing firms. What this is in essence is that you have these foreign exchange markets. You have a foreign exchange market. And what they're meant to do in terms of commodity exchange is they're meant to determine the price of a commodity or the value of a commodity in relation to another commodity. And the reason that this is important is that it's absolutely essential in assisting in international trade. For example, say that you have a UK firm, let's say that they're selling linens. So you have UK Linens Incorporated, and they are trying to sell 100 tons of linens to, let's just go ahead and say, Sleep Country, USA, to turn into beds. So, this is set at the pound sterling price. They're paying in the US price. Prior to foreign exchange markets, these two countries or these two businesses would have to negotiate what that price would be. What would be the commodity exchange rate? Using the foreign exchange market, there is a pre-existing exchange rate for pound sterling in the total, or how much pound sterling 100 tons of linens is into US dollars, which allows Sleep Country USA to pay the exact amount prior to without any negotiation. It just makes international trade a lot easier because it just creates standard values for different currencies. There are some unique aspects to the foreign exchange rate or for currency trading. The first of which is that it is an absolutely enormous market. Nanotrillions, I don't know if that's a real word, but trillions upon trillions of dollars operate within currency trading. Second, it is basically 24 hours a day except for weekends. From like the end of Friday till very late at night Sunday, the currency market is open. Other than that, it is open about 24 hours a day, constant trading, which is very interesting. But which, I mean, it's cool in that it allows you exact up-to-date times on how much the currency is happening. The problem is that you can have similar problems where a currency can experience rapid devaluation. Basically, there is a run on the bank for a currency, and it could dramatically deflate the value of a currency. Subsequently, it could also rapidly lead to inflation of a currency through this type of system because there's very little check on it. And one of the major problems for currency trading is what's called high frequency trading. Because the currency market has relatively low profit margins compared to other fixed income markets, one of the techniques that they have went around to make more money off of this market, which, let's be honest, it is very easy to make money in the in the currency trading market. You just have to make a lot of trades. So they do what's called high frequency trading, which is where you send, a smorgasbord of trades on just hyper fast. You're just moving these trades back and forth very quickly so you can make a few pennies each trade. The problem with this is a fewfold. The first of which is that how many of you have ever heard of the flash crash? That was that was just fat fingers. Someone mishit a button, caused $2 billion of value to be lost. This very likely could happen in a currency, in where you have someone just misenter and you could have a flash crash. For a stock, that's okay because it will rebound quickly. For a currency, that's a little bit more dangerous because it can cause because you don't have there's not going to be internal fighting within Cisco systems where someone tries to take over the CEO's office in some sort of coup. However, if you are an African nation who's just had your currency rapidly devalued, you might have a whole bunch of instability where someone might actually perform a coup. So there are geopolitical implications to high frequency trading. The other problem is that this absolutely ruins overarching trends of the currency because it can cause shakes in essence. There's in essence noise that hits a currency that can cause it to jump up and down a lot, which causes instability in that market. So that type of noise trading, a good example would be the Norwegian krone got noise traded pretty hard in 2011, and there was general concern that Norway's currency was being devalued, or that the global financial economic crisis had hit Scandinavia, which everyone had believed that it had avoided everywhere except for Iceland. But it was just a bunch of high frequency trading. There was just a bunch of people trading the krona real fast. And it was actually just two people in one bank trading the krona a lot really fast between themselves. Yeah.
How long do these flash crashes typically last before they're resolved?
The ones with corporations or with publicly traded markets, with currencies, we don't know because there hasn't been one like that for currencies yet. But with corporations, it can get resolved pretty quickly because you have a CEO who can go and speak to the market and calm tensions. There's other economic data that shows that. But with a currency, it's a whole different question because it's a question of, is it something wrong with the internal strength of a nation's economy, or is there some sort of other issue at play which just breeds fear and breeds risk for investors? Yeah.
For the two guys trading the krona back and forth,
yeah,
is that legal for them to do, or
yes,
did they get in a lot of trouble?
That's legal. Yes.
I don't get how
high frequency trading is legal in the United States. Yeah, totally legal. What's up?
I don't get how you make money off of trading currency.
You buy it low, sell it high. It's just that's.
But don't you have to eventually exchange it back to your currency? Like, isn't there a standard value?
Yeah, but but as long as you're it all transfers back into U.S. dollars, right? The only thing that matters is, do you create wealth in each trade, right? So you buy the Norwegian krone because it's all valued against the U.S. dollar, right? So you buy a certain amount of Norwegian krones at a certain amount of U.S. dollars, and then sell that same amount for more U.S. dollars when the price goes back up for that krone. But since there's so much speculation, for example, one of the things that you can do is by buying a whole bunch of Norwegian krone at a low price, you're going to artificially increase the price for it because there's going to be increased demand for the krone, which means that people are going to buy it because they're going to see increased purchases. You then sell it off real quickly afterwards, and you make a decent profit, but you just keep doing that through trades. That's how you make up for low profit margins in this trade. Yeah.
Obviously, there could be a price of pounds in terms of dollars, a price of dollars in terms of euros, and so forth for all the currencies cross-section. But is there like an abstract unit of measurement, or is it all just cross-sections?
It's all kind of just cross-sections because it's just an open market.
Right.
It is just one of the most open. It's the closest we have to an ideologically perfect market. Yeah.
So for all of these sort of derivative trading or currency trading that you talk about, how active are the insurance markets on these trades?
Like, are you talking about things like default swaps and things like that.
But for currency trading too, it seems like you're
for-
active.
And I probably should have mentioned this with commodity trading. I didn't want to delve this deep, but I probably should. So there are things called credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations, synthetic collateralized debt obligations, synthetic collateralized debt obligations squared, and that is where. So a synthetic collateralized debt obligation squared is where you place a bet on the inverse of a bet of a bet held that's outside of the market. So in synthetic CDO squared is where you place a bet on whether or not a commodity you don't own is going to go up or down, or a stock or some asset is going to go up or down. A CDO squared is where you bet against another person's bet. So a synthetic CDO squared is where you bet against someone else's bet on their bet of a product they never owned.
And what kind of markets are these getting traded on?
Mostly, well, there's a few places. The first would just be the general interbank market, and then the other one would be the commercial paper market. And the commercial paper market's the really bad one because that's the clearinghouse overnight for banks, and that's actually one of the reasons why Lehman Brothers went under, is that they had assets just rapidly devalue overnight and just took a killing in the commercial paper market and shut themselves down. That's, yeah, we could talk ad nauseum about the financial collapse. There was, yeah. So that's like, there's a lot of CDO squareds and synthetic DA CDOs and all those. Yeah, what's up?
Yeah, so on that idea, you said that they bet on a stock that they don't own, is that
Or on
correct?
an asset they don't own.
So then the person who bets against them, do they not own that as well, or are they?
Yeah, they don't own that as well. They're making
Okay,
a bet.
so-
They're making a bet that the other bet is wrong, or they're betting that it's right. For example, they're buying insurance, but it's a bet. I mean, it's called insurance, but it is a bet. It is a calculated risk. Although in a lot of these areas, it is not a calculated risk because they are filing CDOs on assets they don't own that they know are going to fail, and then selling them to people that they know will make them fail. So there's no regulations on that. You can it's ridiculous how you can buy bets on products you don't own that you know will fail to make money. Yeah.
Okay, so if you bet and then there's an inverse of the bet, one of those people wins. What happens to the people that lose? Do they lose money?
Yes.
Tons of it?
Yes. Quite a bit. Yeah. Yeah. Trillions upon trillions of dollars. I mean, what, the 2009 collapse took $2 trillion out of global wealth? The majority of that being the bottom 75%. There's a reason why. I mean, there's other reasons why 401ks are a bad idea, but that made them look like a real bad idea. Yeah.
Besides making money, what's the purpose of doing the bets?
There is no. Making money is the purpose. That is the purpose. They don't serve any economic good.
Well,
They don't. I mean,
what about insurance?
insurance is the real insurance makes sense. Collateralized debt obligations used in a the collateralized debt obligations, if it's used to hedge against a bet you made. But the problem is that when you have these synthetic collateralized debt obligations where you don't actually have any investment in the bet, you're just betting on whether or not it fails or succeeds, is kind of a problem because you can make bets on bets on bets on bets, and most of them are over the counter. They don't even go through an exchange, so you have no idea the value of them. Yeah.
I want to make a really fundamental point about this too, which is that all of these sort of trading, all of these moves are fundamentally people with limited information taking risks based on their perception of how much information they have vis-a-vis their counterparties. And so basically, these are all people who are just sort of gaming against each other, thinking that they have more information, they can make more informed calculations about whether the price is going to go up or down. And that's what's driving all of these things.
Yeah. It's a little bit depressing because it's real bad. But yeah, they don't really help the economy. There's no real purpose that they provide. They say market liquidity, but I don't think that's a good enough reason. Yeah.
So basically, everyone's crazy, and that should just go away.
They're not crazy. They're crazy smart. Like, they are super intelligent. Like, don't get me wrong. The people who came up with a lot of these are ex-Russian astrophysicists who used to build bombs and rockets. I'm not joking. When the USSR collapsed, a lot of people thought that they went to like places like Iran or North Korea or Pakistan to make nuclear weapons. There wasn't nearly enough money in that. There was way more money than going to London and New York and making algorithms to make money, because it's the same fucking thing, right? Math is just the language of science. So they just are good at math. They just changed it. But you also got to realize, as soon as people started to try to regulate this, they just got bought. Like, there's a great story about how there was this one CFTC analyst who figured out what the fuck was going on and how bad this was, and he went to explain it to, I'm pretty sure it was Merrill Lynch, and Merrill Lynch just, in essence, were like, well, what's your salary? We're gonna buy you. Because he could explain what they were doing. He was one of the first people who was actually able to accurately explain what they were doing. So like, oh, we should hire you. You know what we're doing. So sweet, here's a few $1 million a year. Have at it. And that's way better than your shitty CFTC salary. Like, making $65,000 a year to do math is not enough money, especially when you can get paid a lot more to do math for a private firm. Yeah.
I've heard the U.S. makes a lot on financial services. Is this where a lot of it's coming from?
Well, yes and no. So we do have an enormous financial services industry, but a lot of that deals with other questions. Certainly this it is a huge part of it, but we also, you got to think about how much is done just in terms of money market mutual funds, things like 401ks, all of those. The whole there is a huge retirement amount in financial services that gets played around with a lot. And that makes up a whole bunch of money. There's billions upon billions of dollars in pension funds that are coursing through the financial services every single day. Like, you've got the California Teachers Union, which is in a huge union. You've got the AFW's pensions. You've got the SEIU's pensions. All of these are just billions upon billions of fucking dollars in the financial services, because people are trying to make money with their money to retire. Yeah. All right. Let's move on. Anything else about currency trading, though, before we move on? Yeah.
Does high-frequency trading happen with computers a lot?
High-frequency trading is almost entirely on computers.
So it's just like a computer making money for whoever owns the computer?
Yes, it is an algorithm.
Yeah, it's like the most common is called Black-Scholes algorithm. And it's just a bunch of probabilistic analysis. It's just plugging in.
Right. Wasn't there something where the computers have to be plugged in, like at the trading station? There was some.
Yeah. There are people doing HFT at the stock market, but the stock market, like the NYSE, the physical location only accounts for about 30% of the trades made there. The rest of them are made on computers that are just high frequency traders offline. Yeah, that's the percentage of trades, not the percentage of wealth that moves. The percentage of trades happens. Most of them happen off-site on computers, primarily in just these unadorned office buildings right next to, or about less than 1,000 yards away from the stock exchange. Yeah.
Is the primary amount of money that is in circulation, is it mostly just those credits, basically? Like compared to
So money and wealth, or in terms of value, is a different question. So when these things are traded, there's no money value attached to them. There is in essence an agreement that this is equal to the amount of money. It's all of these trades are done through fiat currency. Like, there is no money that really backs up these trades. There is in essence credit of the company that backs up these trades, which is why you buy credit default swaps, to hedge against missing out on these trades. All right, I want to talk about free trade agreements. So, a free trade agreement is very simply an agreement between between two or more nations on set of trade laws between the two. Probably the most notable example is the North American Free Trade Agreement, the negotiation of trade laws between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And there are a whole bunch of different aspects of that. The first of which, though, tends to be a liberalization and a breaking down of tariffs and taxes and duties on imports and exports between countries. There are some other things, though, that are slightly more problematic about free trade agreements that have shown up. The first of which is what's called an FSA, or a financial services agreement. What this is basically an agreement within FTAs, or free trade agreements that the United States has made, to deregulate your financial services sector. And the reason that they wanted to do this, or the reason that this was in free trade agreements, is because around in 99, we were deregulating our banks, right? We wanted to deregulate our banks. I mean, that's when we repealed Glass-Steagall. We passed the commodity futures. Are you okay?
I have the hiccups.
We passed the Commodities Modernization Act of 2000. So at the end of Clinton's years, we were deregulating the banks. Well, the problem is that you couldn't do that with just the United States and a few other countries, because you would have capital flight to safer areas. They would go to markets where people didn't want to take risks. So this was included in free trade agreements and used by financial service firms to basically open up the banking markets of other nations, which ultimately was great for the United States financial services, because it basically mandated that trade be run through financial hubs like Chicago, New York, London, but also subsequently just racked some countries. Like I think that you've seen the damage that was done to Greece through liberalization of its markets, because it ended up buying a lot of really, really bad debt from Goldman Sachs that it wouldn't have been able to buy if it didn't have, free trade connections or problems with the EU mandating those types of things. The other problem with free trade and lowering these types of trade barriers is the problems that affects local populations. How many of you have heard of the tortilla riots in Mexico? A little bit? So what this was is, after NAFTA, the price of the price of U.S. corn got to be too cheap for Mexican producers to compete. So U.S. corn was imported into Mexico, and it eventually undercut and caused a pretty sizable retraction of the Mexican corn growing, because it was just inexpensive. They moved honestly, and I don't mean to be racist, the majority of them moved into growing agave cactuses for tequila, because that was a really easy way to compete with the United States, because the United States did not have neither did Canada, a very good tequila industry. It was a very easy way to have a comparative advantage. So there was, subsequently, what happened is that as the prices began to collapse, and as you had a collapse of the industry, there was a lack of competition in Mexico, because the United States was controlling the corn game, and because there was any other country would have to have tariffs and duties that would come in. The United States was able to raise, or U.S. companies were able to inevitably raise the price of corn to be below what any competitor would have, but high enough to where it priced a lot of the impoverished out of being able to buy that staple, because it was too expensive. So that was the tortilla riots, when they were rioting and throwing tortillas in the air, demanding that this staple, that this idea that maize should not be a commodity we cannot afford, which was what was happening in 2004. Yeah?
I don't mean to like branch off topic, but how accepted is it, sort of the analysis that this is one of the reasons for the drug problem in the United
There
States?
is one major reason for the drug problem in Mexico, in the United States or Mexico.
Well, I mean, what I've read is that since most of these corn farmers, like, they have to shut down their farms because they can't afford to compete, a lot of them end up turning to being like coyotes and running drugs over the border to try to feed their family.
Yeah, that's all. I mean, that is just that is just a matter of circumstance.
Yeah.
The reason that they did that is because we buy a lot of drugs.
That too.
If the United States did not buy as much drugs from Mexico, there would not be nearly the problem there is with cartel violence. I mean, that's on us. I mean, there's plenty of blame to go around for cartel violence, but the United States is certainly up there in terms of blame to be had, and maybe even number one in terms of how much we like drugs and how much we like to sell guns. So those two things are pretty big contributing factors to Mexican drug violence. But certainly a lack of economic opportunity would lead to that as well. But that lack of economic opportunity is partially due to NAFTA. The other example I can think of is a more common example. How many of you are now eating quinoa instead of like other rices like that? You're killing Bolivia.
I'm sorry.
You are murdering that country from the inside out. The rapid expansion of quinoa, particularly quinoa grown outside of Bolivia in areas that have trade with us. So we have a free trade agreement called the DR-CAFTA, which is the Dominican Republic Central American Free Trade Agreement, or as I like to call it, Dr. CAFTA. Dr. CAFTA. So we have a bunch of these Central American countries now growing quinoa. The problem is that because there is such demand for quinoa, the price of quinoa in Bolivia, where it's been a staple for decades, is now outpacing the ability for indigenous to buy it. So the U.S. So the global demand for this product, which, let's be honest, is a primary in the United States, is certainly an affluent white demand. Like that is who's buying it. Like there's a reason why Whole Foods has a quinoa section now, which is fucking ridiculous.
They just at the lunch today was quinoa.
Yeah, I had that.
Like,
Right? Right? Quinoa patties. What?
Why are you going to Whole Foods?
I'm not. I'm just saying they have that now. I'm not going to
Trader
fucking
Joe's,
Whole Foods.
so it needs to know.
Fucking Whole Foods? Are you kidding me? But because of that, the price of quinoa is raised because the global demand has skyrocketed, and because of that, the ability for people it is now significantly more beneficial for producers in Bolivia to ship that shit elsewhere because they're going to make way more money selling it to an area that can afford it. Well, that just means that if you're a Bolivian quinoa picker, you can't afford what you're picking anymore. And that is exactly what's happened, is that the people who are picking the stuff that is being sold cannot afford to buy that staple. And that is, let's be honest, that is probably an aspect of cultural dehumanization. It is probably an aspect of cultural genocide. To take away a critical food staple from a people is certainly an affront to their culture and to their self-actualization. And I know it's silly, but it would be like taking hamburgers away from Americans, or it would be taking beer away from Americans. It would be a shot to the culture. Now, certainly, we don't revere things as much as other cultures do, but it's still certainly true. Yeah.
So I get that the global demand in like more wealthy countries is making it more profitable for them to ship the quinoa elsewhere, but how exactly does a trade agreement affect that?
In this situation, it's not a trade agreement, but it is a trade agreement with other countries because of decreased tariffs and because of increased global demand for a product, while having no tariffs or import duties, countries like Panama, Honduras, Colombia, etc. can grow quinoa because they have similar, or at the very least amenable climates to something that frankly grows primarily anywhere. They now can, in essence, force the Bolivian markets to open up. And they force the Bolivian farmers or force the Bolivian producers to ship it elsewhere because they're just making there's just so much money to be made by shipping it rather than charging the previous market price before increased global demand. And I mean, there are examples of this all throughout the past 20 years of us pricing commodities out of the market. The next one will probably is probably going to be holistic types of medicine. Like, it won't be much longer before we begin to price people out of accessing things that are critical to medicines, because in a lot of countries, simple plants are very easily being able to collected and produced for cheap medicine. It's only a matter of time before global demand for that picks up. Other countries grow it, and it now becomes too beneficial for subsistence farmers, and it now becomes too much of a cash crop for subsistence farmers or for local producers, and big producers have to come in and begin to manufacture it because there's too much fucking money to be made on something that is relatively cheap as per the initial market price it was. Anything else about trade agreements or the ills and the benefits that come from them? Because there are certainly benefits that come from them. You get cheaper shit. Your shit's cheaper because of free trade agreements. Absolutely.
I mean, that's why we send all of our raw materials to China.
Mm-hmm.
It's cheaper to export them.
Well, it's cheap. It's certainly cheaper to pay Chinese labor to. It is cheaper to ship it to China and pay Chinese laborers than it is to have U.S. laborers do it. Tends to be true. Tends to be true. There are other concerns like quality of that labor and some other externalities that you have to think of, but it tends to be cheaper. It tends to be white ship jobs. I mean, when China agreed, when China didn't have a financial services agreement, but when China was being pressured to, this was when they didn't have any, there was no openness to the renminbi. China opened it a little bit in exchange for that, changed a tariff duty over U.S. auto parts, and in about 6 months, 2 million U.S. jobs immediately fled over to China to manufacture auto parts because there was no import duties from Chinese auto parts. So countries immediately went, shit, done in Detroit, done in Flint, let's go to Shanghai, cheaper. And now there's no cost concerns about shipping it back to the United States for Ford, Chevy, and everybody else to use, or to use to manufacture parts or cars. Yeah. So
it's a traditional economic argument that trade betters everybody, leading to more wealth because of comparative advantage. Are there empirical studies about who is bettered, like whether people within America are on the whole bettered despite the fact that there aren't as many laborers?
It would depend. There are some benefits that have come from liberalization of the market. That is absolutely sure. And primarily though, the people who have benefited from that have been people who had a lot of value prior to the deregulation. The people who have certainly suffered the most have been the general populace of the global South. They have primarily been the ones who have been the most affected by liberalization of the markets, because if you're going to liberalize your markets, you can't have corrupt governments or a government that can be corruptible, because the second that happens, you're just a satellite. You're just being used at that point. So the primary losers on free trade expansion has certainly been the most poor, with the exceptions of maybe a few instances of where liberalization of the markets has helped cut against things like the caste system in India, and certainly much more untouchables have been able to access things that they would have not been able to access prior to market liberalization. So there are certainly arguments for why market liberalization and free markets are good. An interesting example is Arizona banned the use of English in business banned the use of anything other than English in business transactions. So banks would only be allowed to talk in English. Most banks said, this law is fucking stupid because we have a shit ton of Spanish-only speaking clientele. We're just going to avoid this law and speak in Spanish, which is an interesting anecdote for solving racism. Is that you can have states create racist laws, but market forces will mandate that they don't get followed. If the market determines that you can't be racist, then the market's going to prevent you from being racist. Yeah. Okay. Shit, we're out of time. I'll just take any more questions that you all have. Yeah.
I heard one about the LIBOR rates. There's just been a lot of talk about that.
Okay.
What are they and what are the impacts?
So the LIBOR rates are the London Interbank Offer Rate, which is the loan rate that banks offer to each other, and it is meant to be a baseline for what you would set loan rates or rates, interest rates, any type of rate that you need to set. If you are setting a financial agreement, you set it against the LIBOR rate. So you may say LIBOR plus 50, which is the interest rate of LIBOR plus an extra 0.5 added onto that. And that's referred to either how much it's going to cost or how much you're going to make. So if you are selling, let's say that you are selling a product that you expect every transaction to make LIBOR plus 50, if you can insure it or get a credit default swap for LIBOR plus 10, you're making 4 percentage points or 4 percentage points off that trade each time. So that's why the LIBOR rate's important. Here's the problem, is that since about 97 hasn't been anywhere near accurate, and it has been fucked with by major banks. They have been setting the LIBOR rate not primarily on a mixture of what interest rates between banks ought to be, but what they want it to be. So they will sometimes artificially set the LIBOR rate higher in order to make more immediate, quicker transactions. But they'll also might set it lower so they can get a LIBOR rate set high, but then when someone offers the credit default rate, the LIBOR rate may be so low that the insurance for it becomes LIBOR plus 10 or LIBOR plus 5, which means that because of that artificial lowering, you're making a whole shit more money than you should be making off credit default swaps than you should, or off collateralized debt obligations than you should. Other questions? Yeah.
Structural adjustment policies, are those still used?
So they don't I don't think they call them structural adjustment programs anymore, because that was a term that not a lot of people like. So just for all of you know, structural adjustment programs are done by the World Bank or the IMF when a country needs to take out emergency loans. So, and these usually come with stipulations. So you're a country, let's say you're Malawi, and you've collapsed and you need an emergency loan. What happens is the World Bank or the IMF gives you a certain amount of money, but in exchange you have to make some sort of structural adjustment to your economy, like privatization of markets and other things like that, deregulations of sectors. Well, the reason that a lot of countries don't like to sign on to structural adjustment programs anymore is, one, that debt is crippling because you can't pay it off, and two, the structural adjustment programs don't tend to help you. Privatization of the market tends to take away a huge aspect for some of these states where revenue is relatively low, either because there's an impoverished populace or there's poor tax collecting measures, or for some reason states, especially smaller states, have to rely on one particular resource to be their main source of revenue. If you deregulate or you privatize that source of revenue, your state goes fucking bankrupt, right? And if that happens, you have to take out subsequently another loan. And this is like cycles of poverty, right? Like you have to constantly be taking out loans to pay off the existing ones because the previous loan fucked you, right? It's like if you took a loan from a bank for a house and they're like, okay, we're gonna give you this loan, but your house can't have any windows or doors. And then when you try to go fix that, they're like, okay, we'll give you a loan to fix those windows and doors that you couldn't have, but we're gonna have some other stipulation to the house. This time now you have to pour rocks down your chimney in order to get your loan. Well, now you can't pay back your loan on that one, so you have, because the chimney's fucking broken, so your house is worthless, so you have to take out another loan to get out from under it, and they make some sort of other problem that prevents you from from being able to build it. So that's why structural adjustment programs are not used as well or are significantly different.
Are they
in how they're
analogous
offered.
to austerity measures?
They are similar to austerity measures. Not all structural adjustment programs have austerity measures, but yeah, they can. They often do, but they don't have to.